tonight. We are in the Psalms, continuing our journey chapter by chapter there. Tonight we find ourselves in Psalm 104. Hopefully you got a Bible and you're making your way there, either in a paper Bible or you're kind of an electronic person and you're kind of following us there. If neither of those things are yours, hey, we have provided Bibles for you. We really want you to follow along because it is God's Word we want you to hear tonight. We want you to hear and see and just respond to Him. So if you need a Bible, they're around you in chairs nearby. Grab one, open it up here to Psalm 104 with the aim and the intention that God would take His Word and just speak it into your life tonight. Let's ask Him for that. Let's take a moment. Bible's open. We've trusted Him with our hearts tonight. Let's ask Him that He would speak to us through His Word tonight. Would you join me? God, would you give us ears to hear? Lord, that we would not in any way miss what you're speaking to us. So many things can get in the way, can cause us to be poor hearers of your voice. God, I bring all of those things before you, and I pray that you'd cause us to be those who fight against those things. And even right now, you would enable that. But then I ask for you to go further and beyond what we could ever do. And Lord, just supernaturally, powerfully, give us ears to hear you tonight. Speak to us by the power of your word and the presence of your Spirit and your faithfulness. God, help. We ask for that tonight as we just bring this evening before you. Help us to hear what you're saying. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. As I was thinking about this psalm some this week, I found myself just being drawn to one of those familiar hymns. I'm sure that many of you guys know it. You know, This Is My Father's World. If you know the hymn, just kind of like raise your hand so I can see that I'm not the only one. There's a few of you. It's a good one. It's written about 1902. It's a great hymn in many ways, and yet I was just thinking of some of the words. My favorite in the midst of it, or I'm sorry, how it begins, is it says, this is my Father's world. And to my listening ears, all nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. And it's just this idea that everything around us in creation is speaking. And my favorite part, which I started to say, is where it simply says it this way. It says, this is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong so often seems strong, God is the ruler yet. I don't know if that just meets anybody else this evening. Sometimes you just have to feel that way. You feel like the world itself feels wrong. Feels like so often things are going wrong, and yet there's a reminder that it's His world. He's the God who's the creator. He's the God who's the designer. He's the one that's working in this. In fact, in the midst of that hymn, it simply says it this way. It says, this is my Father's world. He shines in all that's fair. In the rustling grass I hear Him pass. He speaks to me everywhere. In many ways, that becomes the theme of it. This idea that through the very creation around us, God is talking to us. I find myself thinking of that and then how it's worded for us maybe in that well-known psalm. Way back in Psalm 19, where it just considered it and told us as it began that psalm, that the heavens declare the glory of God. And the firmament shows His handwork. Day unto day it utters speech. Night unto night it reveals knowledge. That it just tells us God is talking. God is talking to us. Psalm 19 goes on to talk about how He does that, and then more powerfully through His Word. But it's also worth noting that God is talking. God is speaking to us, and He's speaking to us through His world. He's speaking to us through the creation that He has made. Again, I love the way it just says it. Day unto day it utters speech. Like every day, God's creation is speaking to us. It's just talking. If we but hear what God would say, just every day, every night, there's things that the creation itself would just remind us and cause us to hear. And it's one of the amazing things to become attuned to be one of those ones that hears what God is saying. Well, I draw your attention to that because in many ways, that's everything that this psalm is. What the first part of Psalm 19 is, all of Psalm 104 is celebrating God is our creator, celebrating what he has done in the midst of his creation, celebrating how we see that and how we respond to it. And this evening, I just want to speak that to you. I want to speak it to you in a way that strengthens that, where that's in your life. And maybe even today, God was talking to you through his creation. I just want to just echo that. But I also want to do it in a way that opens this up afresh. Maybe it's never been that way for you. Maybe you've never been one that has, looked out at God's creation and thought for a moment that through it, God himself was speaking. And you just didn't even know that you should be listening. I want to tell you to listen. But I'm speaking also to those who've done that in the past, and it's been a while. It's been a while. Somehow you've gotten distracted, and we live in such a distracted world. It's been a long time since you sat out in a night sky and just watched the stars for a little while and thought of the Creator that's there. That you sat there and watched a sunset and considered just the incredible beauty of our God who designed such colors, who paints that picture. That you've kind of thought, just not stopped and looked at a flower and just looked at it and thought, my God, you made this. I want to just encourage that to your life this evening and tell you in this psalm, it's that kind of reality we want to speak to. And by the end of it, we're hoping that it just strengthens us to be those who hear that, who are in tune with the voice that God is speaking in our world. Well, with that and just marching, just notice there as it begins, Psalm 104, it has no inscription. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know anything about it. It just launches. It says in verse 1 there, "Bless the Lord, O my soul." Quick pause there. Let me just say this. If you were with us, obviously last week we had the special RFK thing. I wasn't here. The week before we did Psalm 103. And if you were here, that was the theme. Psalm 103 was about bless the Lord, O my soul. It's how he began, how he ended the psalm. It's an interesting way that even how this one's positioned, that coming right off this place where we're saying, God, I want to be someone who doesn't forget the benefits that are mine, that I remember his incredible work in my life. And he begins it with that and then says this, again, bless the Lord. O my soul, O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty. You cover yourself with light as with a garment, who stretch out the heavens as a curtain. We are looking at God as the creator, but one of the clear things it begins with is we're looking at a God who is great. I love the way it just says it, where it just says, Lord, you are very great. It might sound almost unnecessary, but I want to tell you it is necessary. We want to think about God's incredible work in this creation. We're going to talk about it a little bit through this psalm, but if we don't say it clearly now, we're going to try to say it here in the beginning and the end. It's about him. I mean, the thing that we're ultimately looking at is how incredibly great our God is. Think about the whole Bible. It begins that way, does it not? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. Before we talk about anything that he makes, it's as if we just need to see that it begins with him and that it begins with who he is, that we're thinking about who he is, and he's just inviting us to say, what an incredibly great God we have. That you would say, oh Lord my God, you are very great. You're clothed with honor and majesty. Just thinking of who he is as a majestic and powerful God. You cover yourself with light as with a garment. That in him there's no darkness at all. That's definitely a reality, and yet there's some interesting things. I won't spend much time in it because it would probably take way too long to process, and in the end probably not overly be helpful. There is an interesting thing about this psalm that has some interesting tie-ins to Genesis 1 and 2. That some feel that Psalm 104, it really is kind of a song that accompanies Genesis 1 and 2. That there's almost even some connections that flow there, and actually that's how it begins in Genesis. God created, right? And he created light. He said, he just said, let light be, let light just enter into the world, and it did. Before there was a sun, before there were stars, which is just fascinating all by itself. But in many ways, just letting us know that part of creation, it's God himself. clothed with light, clothed with who he is, just this incredible God that we should be able to see and understand. He invites us to be able to say that and to be able to say, God, you are very great. And then he just takes that, and in verses 3 through 9, he just gives us a picture of how God did that. Again, he's going to walk us a little bit through pieces of his creation. There's different ways you could outline it or see it and understand it. There is this interesting interchange that's moving back and forth. I won't spend much time just, emphasizing it, but I just want you to notice it at the beginning. Sometimes it's talking directly to God. Other times it's talking about him. So that you'd have it just, there in verse 1, "O Lord my God, you are very great." And then turns and sings about him in verse 3. He lays. And there's this kind of interesting interchange poetically, and we do the same sometimes in the way that we talk about God and even sing about him, but it's fun just even to notice it. Some of that even becomes a little bit of this poetic moving back and forth. Well, again, just noting that quickly, he lets us know what he does, and just walks us through the creation that God made. I'll just give it to you this way. It's my outline of it. It's not necessarily, the inspired outline. It's just the way my brain wraps around it. If it helps, great. As he begins to help us to see this, he begins with how God worked in the midst of the heavens and the earth. I think about how, again, it told us in Genesis 1 that God created. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that begins to kind of flow into the way this works. And so he begins just describing the heavens. He begins describing just the sky, the very presence of God in the midst of all of it. Notice how he says it. He says it in verse 3. He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters, who makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers a flame of fire. It's as if you're looking at the creation, and we begin just by thinking of what God made. And even, again, Genesis 1, for those who are familiar with it, how God made the firmament above and the firmament beneath, and begins to describe, just the sky and the atmosphere. And so he lays this out here, that God has laid those upper chambers, that he's laid, just if we would want to put it this way, the ozone layer and just the waters in the sky and everything that's there, that he's done that. He's made then the clouds to exist, in the midst of creation, which is fascinating. It says, that he makes the clouds his chariot, who walks on the wings of the wind. I like that. I don't even know how to better say that, because I just like that as a description, that he walks on the wings of the winds. That the clouds themselves, they are his chariots. Do you ever just find yourself looking at clouds? I mean, just like looking at them, and just there's something majestic about them. Sometimes you can just get distracted by the clouds, but I just want to give this to you, to see them as if it's as if the chariots of God, as if, you look on those and God himself walking in the midst of his creation, that all of those things define, he invented it, he created it. But beyond that, it says he makes his angels, verse 4, spirits, and his ministers of flames of fire. That when we think about the heavens itself become this fascinating thing. That sometimes when we talk about the heavens biblically, many of you guys will understand, there are really at least 3 different designations. Sometimes when we talk about the heavens, we are talking about the clouds. So the Bible would say, hey, the birds are flying in the midst of the heavens. Sometimes we're talking about space, outer space. And it'll talk about the stars being in the heavens and what they are. But then there's also a third heaven, which is God's presence, which is invisible to our eyes, where angels themselves reside and where his throne is. And so all of that is just compacted in these few verses, where it just says, we're looking at this creation. It's as if we could look up there and see the sky and realize that God made that in the clouds, and then realize there's things we don't even see. I mean, he made all of that. Angels themselves exist in that. Our God created. Our God invented it. It didn't exist without his thought. He's the one that thought it up. He is the greatest creative ever, who looked upon it and just made it, who made the heavens themselves. Then he continues and he switches from where he was talking about he did this, again speaking to God, and he begins to talk about what God did in making the earth. It says, you laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. Again, in fascinating things, he looks upon our planet and says, God, you made this. You made the very foundations. You made them strong. You made it so our planet exists and is in the midst of this, that all that we have and all that we are, it's firmly held in his hand until he makes it anew. And as he lays that out, just in huge ways, he then adds to it, and well, in verses 6 through 9, that God made the waters. It says you covered, that is, you kind of covered all of creation with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valley, to the place where you founded for them. You've set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. It's a pretty neat poetic description, and honestly, it probably has kind of a double picture. Some of it is the picture of the original creation, that God made the waters above and the waters beneath, and he appointed places for the waters, and you go and you read Genesis 1, and you can look and think, okay, this is God, he made this. But some of the wording also seems to reflect not just a Genesis 1, but a Genesis 8, following the global flood. Kind of a picture of where the waters covered the earth, and then God, brings them down and brings them into the place that they'll never come up again into such a place, and huge things. But they define everything. That in many ways, when you look at this, and again, I'm not the best person to define all these things because it just boggles my mind. But when you think about water, it is really in so many ways one of the essences of life itself. And so to spend these verses that God, you made that. You put that there. That water itself has its appointed places. You covered it. You made a place for it. That water went into the valleys to the place that you've appointed for them. Boundaries that they no longer can cross. Because God said it will never happen again. That the global flood that did take place never will happen again. Find ourselves just fascinating looking at everything that's here, and there's something about this that just causes us, if we could see it, to consider the great majesty of God. Hey, can I just get on a small personal rant just for a second, just when I think about that? It is to me one of the sad realities, one of the very grievous realities over the evolutionary mindset that has kind of gripped our world. See, there's something about it because of the lie of evolution. It's become so pervasive. So many things that would be this constant reminder of a global flood, of what God has done in the world, it's entirely missed. People go to the Grand Canyon, or they go and they watch places of sedimentary layers, and they're like, isn't that great? Millions of years did that. And, if you're a Bible person, you're like, no, actually, everything you see, you can go out to the, crazy deserts in Arizona and look at these things that you just know water did that. And people are like, well, maybe water was there. And you're like, water was there. I just know water was there. It covered the world. That's what you're looking at. Don't you see it? Everything around us defines what God is and what he's doing. And one of the very sad realities that I consider one of Satan's just kind of master lies, it just makes people don't see it. But it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be something that you look there and you look and think, okay, this is God. This is what he's doing. And Satan is always stealing that. He steals it with evolution. He steals it even, we talk about the global flood, and again, I'm on my little rant, so I'm going to get off it in just a second. I think about Satan as he's a thief. He steals the rainbow. It tells us that God made the rainbow as a promise for what is there in verse 9. He said, you set a boundary over it. It'll never happen again. The waters will never just flood the world again. And God gave us the rainbow as a sign of that promise so that when people would see the rainbow, it would be like, God is faithful. God is never going to do that again. And we live in a world where Satan has stolen that. And it's just what he does. It's just what he does. He's a thief all the time. But the sad reality is it causes us at times not to hear. Because we're just so distracted by what the world is saying. And that's so much what Satan is trying to do. I just want to tell you, my goal for my life is to try to get past it and think, well, that may be what the world is hearing, but I want to hear a different voice. I want to hear the voice of the Creator who made this thing, who designed it, and it's beautiful, and it's talking to me. The waters themselves, the places of everything in there, that he's that God who made everything. So in verses 3 through 9, it is again just a perspective of that everything that exists, the heavens, the earth, the waters, he made it. His design, his stamp on it. There's something that just defines who he is. But we're not just looking at the past. We're not just looking at the beginning. Well, he continues the psalm and really looks about how that God sustains everything. That behind this world that God made, he's still the one that is presently sustaining the world that he created. Notice what he says. He just talks about it in verses 10 through 13, how God is the one who's sending waters into the world to continuously provide. He sends the springs into the valley. They flow among the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst. By them the birds of the heavens have their home. They sing among the branches. He waters the hills from his upper chambers. The earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works. God is sending. God is providing. He is so created and working in the midst of our world right now that he didn't just design the thing and kind of set it in motion and no longer involved. He's presently involved, so much so that he's sustaining it. Here again is a big part of our danger. For many of us, we spend our days inside four walls. We walk on asphalt and concrete. And sometimes the thing is we just forget. We see so much of what men do, and we forget how much is just taking place in the midst of creation, and in so many ways, how dependent on it we are. I mean, there's just this arrogance sometimes that we can have as Americans in this world. It's like, oh, we can fix anything. We just turn on the water, it's there, as if somehow we really control the world. We don't. We live under God's pleasure all the time. Where God did not do that, if he were to turn off the water, if he were to not supply not only would all the animals, we would immediately find ourselves being destroyed. There's something about understanding that right now, this creation, God is working. He's been feeding animals around the world today. I mean, you got to picture the scenes that we just pictured. I mean, he's like, there are these birds in the trees, and he's provided for them. There are these wild donkeys. He has quenched their thirst today. He says he gives drink to every beast of the field in verse 11. I mean, he is the one who is this provider that is working in the midst of our world. Now, it is a broken world. Sin has destroyed it, and we mess it up. So maybe some of you are like, well, what about the deserts? What about the barren spaces? That's what we've done. But God is still working. He is faithfully working in the midst of those things, and it's an amazing perspective where we look at God as one who's providing the water of life, who's providing everything that's there. On top of that, he supplies. He's the supplier of the food that's feeding and working in the midst of this. It says in verse 14, he causes the grass to grow for the cattle and the vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth, and wine that makes glad the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and the bread which strengthens the man's heart. This is if he just looks on this and says, when you really look on all of this, I mean, he's the one that's providing it. And again, I'm talking to myself, so just maybe it's working for you as well. Here's the danger. Again, we live in this crazy world where for some of us, it's like, where does food come from? And we're like, from Walmart. I mean, it's like it's on the shelves. I mean, it's where you just go and you get it, and you somehow lose the idea. It's like, wait a second. No, nothing would exist if he didn't provide it. I mean, we cultivate what he gives. We package, we grow, but we would not be able to do any of those things outside of his provision. I mean, the reason we are able to, package and sell and put, it's because God is the provider behind everything. And he is presently doing that. So that when you look at it, when you can look at this, he's the one that causes the grass to grow. Again, verse 14, he causes the grass to grow for the cattle, the vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth food from the earth. I mean, he's the one that's doing this. He's the one that designed it, and he's still actively involved. He's still actively involved in it. He's the one, I mean, we didn't invent it. We didn't cause it. We enjoy it. We, take part in what he's designed, but ultimately it's all of his design. Again, there's just such arrogance at times that comes in our generation, because you can find people that, think, hey, we can do anything. I mean, we can come up with anything. And I just want to say it as carefully and clearly as I can. All we can do is work with what he's given us. We can't ever create anything. Mankind can never create out of nothing anything. We never do. We never create anything out of nothing. God did. God created everything. He's the one that breathed into life. And all that we can do with our inventiveness, with the wisdom of man, is manage what he's given to us. To take what God has given to us and use it well, to dive into it, but we'd never have it outside of his design. We'd never have it outside of his provision. And he just calls us to this. He just calls us to see this. So he's the one that's watering. He's the one that's providing food. He's the one that's even made a home. And he just gives it to us in a couple of pictures. He says, the trees of the Lord are full of sap in verse 16. The cedars of Lebanon, which he planted, where the birds make their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high hills are for the wild goats. The cliffs are a refuge for the rock badgers. And it's looking at God who's made not only where he's providing water, where he's providing food, but he's made spaces. He's made places. He's provided for the creation that he designed, which is amazing. He calls us to see all that is, and then beyond that, in verse 19 to 23, he lays it out in its seasons. He says, he appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down. You make darkness, and it is night, in which all the beasts of the forest creep about. The young lions roar after their prey, and they seek food from God. When the sun rises, they gather together and lie down in their dens. Man goes about his work and his labor until the evening. So not only are we kind of gazing at God creating the water and the food, but now just the very rotation of the earth, day and night, seasons that work in the midst of this. And our God is a God who's doing things, who's providing in the midst of it, that he's a God who's appointed it, he says in verse 19. He's appointed so that the very seasons themselves, whether they be 24-hour seasons of day and night, whether they be spring, fall, winter, and summer, whether they be the seasons that God works, he's a God who's working in the seasons. And there's just something about seeing that and understanding, and all of that is there's this majestic wisdom and picture of who God is. So we're looking at all this, and again, we could talk about it in much, much more detail had we time, but how do you respond to that? I mean, what do you do with that? Well, in many ways, that's what the remainder of the psalm does. We've looked at God and just said, God, you're great. You just made everything. You made the heavens and the earth, and you're the one who's sustaining them. You're working in the midst of them right now. And he begins to just help us understand, well, how do we respond to that? Well, there's at least 4 things that he shows us in how we would respond. The first is found there in verses 24 to 26, where it just calls us to see God's wisdom. O Lord, it says, just kind of turning and just speaking now directly again to him. O Lord, how manifold are your works in wisdom. You made them all. The earth is full of possessions. This great and wide sea, which is innumerable teeming things, living things both small and great. There are ships that sail about. There is the Leviathan, which you have made to play there. He just looks on all of God's creation. He looks upon all that it is. He says, when you look at it, and all of its immensity, and all of its majesty, he just says, how manifold are your works. How much these things describe you. They show who God is and his wisdom. Well, once more, in all of it, that's what you're supposed to be seeing. That when you walk out and you see a sunset, or you watch the clouds, or you see the stars, or you think about something about it's like, God, how wise, how incredibly full of wisdom, how incredibly powerful. I mean, he's the one that thought it. He's the one that caused it. And so there's a call that we would just say, God, all of this declares your wisdom. All of this declares how wise you are. On top of that, well, we've already said it a little bit, but we're also supposed to see how dependent all of this is on him. He says in verse 27, these all wait for you. Like, everything exists because of you, and all of it's dependent on you, that you may give them their food in due season. What you give them, they gather in. You open your hand, and they are filled with good. You hide your face, and they are troubled. And take away their breath, and they die and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, and they are created. You renew the face of the earth. And it's just this place of looking again and just saying, hey, as amazing as this creation is, it's entirely dependent on him. You just need to understand that, because again, that's just not what our world is telling you. Our world is telling you, hey, this is happening automatically. Like, this is just going to go. It's like, you don't know. I mean, he withholds his hand for a moment. I mean, he just turns his face, and you just picture this. If you just hide your face, it's just going to bring trouble. A place where you are not shining, where God's work is, that's just trouble. If he entirely were to take away their breath, all there is death. We are entirely dependent on him. When we think about God's creation, there is a sense again of understanding how connected it is and how dependent everything is upon him, and you and I are called to see that. I wish I could say that better than I'm saying it. But I'm just telling you, there's a huge lie out there. It's a satanic lie that just wants you to think, well, no, it just happens. It's kind of, the earth is rotating on its axis, and there's this, it just happens. I mean, it doesn't just happen. It never could have happened if he didn't make it, and he's holding it now. I mean, like right now. I mean, nothing's happening. If he wasn't just holding our world together, it would not be held together. There's just something about seeing this, how dependent we are on him. We see his wisdom, we see our dependence, and so the psalmist just longs for it, and he cries out that God would be glorified through his creation. It says in verse 31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works. He looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the hills and they smoke. It's a desire, it's a request. God, may you be glorified in the midst of your creation. God, would people see how amazing you are to your creation? It's a prayer. It's a good prayer. It's my prayer for us here this evening. But it's even a desire for God. The idea is, it says, may the Lord just rejoice. God, may you find pleasure in it. God, may your creation just be pleasurable to you. May you find the things that you're holding and doing. There's this desire that God, who is the creator God, the inventor, the sustainer, the one who holds all of it, that we just long that he would both be recognized and appreciated and enjoyed in the midst of his creation. It's a good prayer. So we're responding to this. We see his wisdom. We understand our dependence. We're praying and even just asking that God would be glorified. And the psalmist then ends it with his part of it, just saying, here's what I'm going to do. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. May my meditation be sweet to him. I will be glad in the Lord. The psalmist is just talking to us tonight, and he's told us some things. He's told us of how God's creation is amazing. And it's as if now he says, okay, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it. I mean, if you're not going to look out at God's creation and go, God, you're amazing. God, you're glorious. God, you're wise. God, you're powerful. God, if you're not going to do it, the psalmist says, I'm going to. I'm going to do it. I'm going to sing to the Lord as long as I live. I'm going to find my pleasure in him. I'm going to sing my praise to God. And obviously, in the midst of this, the idea is that's how he's going to respond to God's creation. He's like, I'm going to allow just everything I see, whether it be the stars or the clouds or the waters or the animals, or I'm just going to say, God, all of this is going to compel me to worship you. I'm going to be this one that I can think on this. He says, when I think about these kinds of things, verse 34, I just want it to be sweet to him. I want God to look and think, you get it. Like you're understanding what the world is so much not understanding right now. You're seeing past the lies of the enemies. He says, when I think about this world that God made and this world that God's sustaining, I just want God to be pleased with that. But he still makes the decision. He says, here's what I'm just going to be glad. I'm just going to be glad in him. I'm going to find my joy in a God who is so good to me. I'm going to find my joy in looking at his creation and recognizing his great goodness. And I'm just telling you, that's a good place. And I want to say it. I don't know if I'm making sense tonight. I don't know if I'm strengthening this in your life like I'd like to be doing. My hope is that you would be someone who hears and sees God's creation and go, like, I'm going to be one that sings about those things. I'm going to be one that recognizes it. But if you don't, I hope I am. Because I want to be that. I want to be one that says that. And yet it's with this, he ties in this thought that almost catches you off guard if you're reading it, if you're paying attention, because we've just been thinking about how beautiful, like, God, you made this, you're the creator, you're the sustainer. I mean, this is a beautiful thing. And then he says this, verse 35, may sinners be consumed from the earth and the wicked be no more. It's as if he looks out and says, here's the thing. This world is broken, and there's sinners that are so out of tune with what God is and what he's doing. And they've rejected this very thing. I find myself thinking about it, and many have noted the correlation with what Paul says in Romans 1, where he simply says, since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. I mean, he's just saying the same thing that we've tried to say tonight. He says, since God made everything, he created the world, it's telling us something. God's attributes are seen in his creation, so that we would recognize he's a God who's real, he's a God who's creator, he's a God who's designer. He says that all these things are being understood, that he made them, his eternal power and his Godhead, and yet he says here's this world that rejects that rejects, hey, God made this, God created this, and he says they've hardened themselves against him, and he goes on to talk about just the rebellion of mankind that has caused us to sin and reject God as a creator. And I'm just telling you, there's such a reality of this. We live in a world that is rejected this. But I'm just speaking this in the context of hope. Because in reality, that's all of us. All of us are a part of that sinful mankind. All of us are a part of the thing that's broken in this world. And yet, here in Romans, what he's talking about is the power of the gospel. He says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes. He says, I just want to tell you about the good news of Jesus Christ, because this world is broken. Mankind has rejected God as their creator, but we have a God who has, sought to remedy that, who sent his son into the world to do that. And I think about everything that this is, and it makes it just a little bit more sense that we get to this place in the psalm. It's like, yeah, that's the problem. Men are broken. Men are broken, and what we need is the gospel and the hope that would rescue us and bring us back. And yet, here's the reality for those who don't respond to the gospel. Well, what he's asking for, may sinners be consumed from the earth and the wicked be no more. That's honestly going to happen. Sometimes I think about it this way. Creation itself, it's affected by our sin, but in so many ways it's still attuned to the God who created them. If we were to use this in some kind of musical analogy, which is probably something I shouldn't do since I'm not a musician, the only thing that's out of tune in this creation is us. We're the ones who aren't paying attention to the Creator, who aren't responding to the God as our Creator and Sustainer. And eventually God's going to get rid of that. Eventually He's going to fix the world. He's going to remove everything that rejects Him as the Creator, Him as the Sustainer, Him as the glorified one. God's going to fix the world. And the beauty that's still evident in this broken world is going to be fully restored. That's what he's thinking about here, is he just says, okay, there's this day when all of that's going to be fixed. And I think it's amazing. It's a glorious thought. But it just speaks to me to say this to you. I hope this evening that you're on the right side of that. I hope this evening, as we're talking about God's creation and His beauty and all that He is, and then the brokenness of sinners, that the gospel has met you where you are and drawn you to the right side of that. Because if you're not, then I just want to tell you, hey, this is a good night to, in response to that, to find yourself being repaired. To think, okay, I don't get it. I've bought into the lie of evolution. I've bought into the lie that man is the creator and sustainer, and we're all those things that we are not. Then I just would long that today you would just recognize, no, everything around you is telling you. Everything around you is telling you that there's a God. There's a God who made and created. There's a God who's holding, and you desperately need Him. Well, the psalm brings us to all of that, and it ends where it began. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Like our response to this, our response to the God who is so amazing is to bless Him. I just again speak that to you and just tell you, I hope that's where you are. I hope I'm just reminding you some things that are a part of that. But every day, God is being glorified and spoken of in His creation. He's just inviting us to be those who hear that. And where we are out of tune of that, that's what we desperately need to be fixed with. And the fix for us, if I can say it in the most simple way, is the gospel. It is what Jesus did for us. That's kind of where I want to segue out of this and into the remainder of our evening, because maybe you know, it's the end of July, it's our last Wednesday night, and we're going to move into a time that we're going to take communion tonight. And we think when we take communion, it's a part where we seek to enter into a place of remembering what Jesus did for us, the gospel that accomplished in our life. And I want to invite you into it from this angle this evening. As we take communion this evening, I long for you to look upon this and recognize, God made everything, and we rebelled. God made everything, and it's good, and we messed it up. And God so loved the world that He sent His Son to restore that, to bring us back to Himself and back in tune with creation and back in tune with everything that He is. And if that's not where you are this evening, again, I'm just inviting you, even as we take communion, that it would be a time of your surrender. But if you're out of tune this evening, even just in coming and just remembering Jesus and remembering His death and resurrection for your behalf, I long that it would be kind of a tuning instrument in your life. That if you're out of tune with God, you're out of tune with Him right now, you're out of tune with Him as the creator and sustainer, and you're just, that through just coming to the cross tonight, just like, God, just bring me back. Just fix my soul into this place where I need to be. Just want to invite you to do that. So here's how we're going to do that. You guys may be aware, but again, just some quick reminders. When we take communion on Wednesday night, which we do on the last Wednesday night of every month, we do it a little bit different in that in a moment I'm going to pray. When I'm done praying, then Pastor Phil's going to be leading us in some closing worship songs. We're going to close in 3 worship songs, and why we do that, we're just going to place the communion elements up here on the stage. And what we want to invite you to do is when you're ready, come up and take communion. It's personal, yet it's still corporate. You're here in the midst of people, so you're doing that, but there's just a moment we long for you to just personally just take hold of this and enjoy and recognize Christ just in His work in your life. You're invited to do that at any point in these closing 3 songs. Again, 3. We're going to have 3 songs, so you don't have to rush up. I mean, if it's like a line or something, like you can wait if you're not ready. I mean, if you just want to, hey, just let it kind of roll over you for a moment and just kind of get your heart right, you can come up in the first song, the second song, third song. You can take communion up here. You can take the bread and the cup back to your chair and take communion there. You can stand, you can kneel. Hey, if you take them back to your chair, if you've never figured it out, can I just give you a quick little aside? There's communion cup holders on those little metal things under the chairs. So like if you're like, I have no idea what to do with my cup, there's little bitty circles there. And you can just, when you're done, you can put your cup there. Just because I know, because like some people said, I don't know what to do with it, and I broke it, and then okay, that's just sorry. So hey, whenever you're ready, just you can take communion up here, you can take it there, and then just continue in worship with us, just in a place of just recognizing who He is and be in tune with the God who is the creator, sustainer, the very incredibly good God. So, those are your instructions. Take communion whenever you're ready. Worship with us, and in the midst of it, may God just meet you and tune your life back into who He is. Will you join me? Let's pray for that right now. Father, we come into this place this evening, and we've thought through just briefly what an incredible reality it is that you are our Creator. Everything that exists because you made it. Lord, your wisdom is seen, your manifold works, your glorious power. But God, we also recognize there's brokenness in this world, sinners that are out of tune with your creation. And in truth, all of us were that. Thank you that you sent your Son to rescue us from our bondage and our brokenness, to bring us back to yourself and into a place of just joy in you as our Creator and Sustainer and holder of life. God, for anybody who's here this evening that's not there, that doesn't know you, I pray that you would rescue them now. And then for those that know you, for those who are in tune with you, would you just strengthen them in this time of taking communion? Those who are out of tune with you, Lord, would you use just this reminder of the death and resurrection of Jesus to draw us to you and cause us to worship you? God, to that end, would you just forgive us now? Would you cleanse us? Would you fix and heal all that is broken? Would you cause us just to be right with you now? And give us ears to hear you in your creation. I ask it in Jesus' name.